Good afternoon, everybody. We'll give it a minute or two for other folks to sign on. All right, and I just realized for whatever reason, the PowerPoint for our first chapter wasn't on Blackboard, so it's up there now if anyone wants to download it so they can use it to follow along. So I'm glad I checked that. Alrighty, well, hopefully other folks will sign on and find their way. There are 24 of y'all, but I figured we'd start today by just doing names again, just so, again, y'all can start to get to know each other, see each other, hear each other. Yeah, happy snow day. Here's the fun part about all this is I got an email from my dean yesterday that basically said, well, since you all know how to do remote classes now, you know, even if it snows, we won't have a snow day. So like, are we never having a snow day again? Quinn's school was just delayed, so I was able to be here. I mean, if she was here, it would be an interesting thing. But yeah, if it snows more and her school would be closed, y'all would actually have a snow day. Like a lot of my professor friends with kiddos had to do that today. So thanks for being here. Hopefully you have gotten to enjoy this weather, either from inside or outside. Yeah, like I said, we will do just names. And I realized on Tuesday that I forgot to have y'all do class year. And I'm just sort of curious. So just say your name and your class year. And you know what, I'll put it in the chat again. It's just because I feel like it helps. And then call on someone else. Alrighty, and I'm gonna call on Tacy because she's right next to me.
I didn't hear. Did you call on me? Okay. Sorry, my hair is a mess. Hi, I'm Kristen. My class year is 2022. Is that all I have to say? I'm sorry.
Yep, just call on the next person.
Carly.
Hi, I'm Carly. I'm a junior. Jackie.
I'm Jackie. I'm also a junior. Hayden.
I'm Hayden. I'm a senior. Kenzie.
I'm Kenzie. I'm a senior. And Emily.
I'm Emily. I'm a senior as well. Alexis.
I'm Alexis. I'm a senior too. Autumn.
I'm Autumn. I'm a senior in India.
Hi, my name's India. I'm also a senior, and Danny.
I'm Danny. I'm also a senior, and Steven.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm a sophomore, and Jordan. I'm Jordan. I'm a senior. And Sherelle.
Hi, I'm Sherelle. I'm a senior. And did Greta go?
I'm Greta. I'm a senior. Tacey.
Sue.
I'm Kaylee Sue. I am a junior. And Casita?
Hi, I'm Casita. I'm a senior. Naila.
Hi, I'm Naila. I'm a senior, and Annika.
I'm Annika. I'm a senior. Let's see, Savasia.
I'm Savasia. I'm a senior. And did Aaron go? I don't even see Aaron in here. Who didn't go yet? Sorry. Oh, Michaela.
Hi, I'm Michaela and I'm a sophomore. And I don't know if Jordan went.
I did.
Okay.
Trying to look. I think everyone who's here has gone. If you haven't gone, just unmute and introduce yourself. All right, I think that was everybody who's here. And like I said, we do have about 3 more people in the class who hopefully will be able to make their way in. So today we're going to start just talking about what is psychology and the law. If we get to it, there is a group activity we'll do. If we don't get to it till Tuesday, no biggie. I guess that's another thing the pandemic has done for me is I'm just like much more flexible than I ever have been. Like, stuff happens when it happens. So I have my makeshift podium. It's a music stand. So I'm going to stand up just again so you get a little bit more of the energy you would get where I actually teaching. And let me get my PowerPoint rolling here. And again, for those who might have come in a little bit later, I realized as I was starting the Zoom that I hadn't put the PowerPoint on Blackboard for some reason. Like all the other chapters are there, but this one wasn't. So it's there now. So if you want to download it and take notes in the notes section or do screenshots and put those in your Word notes, however it works best for you. I just find it really helpful to have the PowerPoints when I'm attending any kind of lecture. And again, I fully acknowledge I talk quickly, even when I purposely slow myself down. So that's why I provide these. So let me get this rolling. All righty. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're going to start by just talking about, how psychology gets involved in the legal system and how the legal system responds to psychology. So you can unmute or you can just type in the chat. What are some of the ideas you've seen about how psychology intersects with the law in terms of maybe like movies, TV shows, things like that?
I always think of forensic psychology. So like whenever I tell people about forensic psychology, I say the Asian guy on Law & Order SVU. So B.D. Wong was actually a forensic psychologist on the show. And basically just kind of dealt with the victims and the criminals and kind of figuring out why they do what they do. And there's a lot of tests that can kind of not prove people's innocence, but support different ideas as far as guilty or not guilty. And I actually did an internship with forensic psychology and shadowed a forensic psychologist. And I got to like see things like head on with people like accusing other people of marital rape and so on. And you can really kind of see who is telling the truth.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good example, is that we often see forensic psychologists, and just so you all know, if you haven't had a chance to read the chapter yet, forensic psychology is the term used to describe the subfield of psychology that interacts with the law. When I took this class, or the equivalent of this class in graduate school, it was actually just called forensic psychology. Yeah, and it makes it look pretty exciting, right? Pretty glamorous. But Naila, I really like that you pointed out, you know, the use of assessments, because that's a big part of what you do if you are a practicing forensic psychologist. Is a lot of your time is spent assessing people for various reasons. Yeah, what other impressions do people have, or have you seen psychologists portrayed? What kind of things do they do in the media, movies, that type of thing?
Like the number one thing I think of when I think of psychology is the stereotypical, like, laying down on the couch and they're asking you, so how are you feeling today? Like, that's one thing that I think of. And then I also think of Criminal Minds, because that's kind of what I want to do. So like Naila said, interviewing criminals, interviewing victims, and this, that, and the third. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. India, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I was thinking of like custody cases, like family court and things like that. Like when they're trying to figure out who the kid should stay with, or if anyone should lose custody, they go to like therapy or some kind of counselor or whatever, and they figure it out and then relay it back to a judge. That's like the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, that was actually the only clinical work besides supervising us in our clinical work that my grad advisor did, where she did child custody cases sort of on the side. And she talked to us about how difficult it is, right? As you can imagine, like you're kind of helping decide the rest of this kid's life, right? Any other ideas people have?
Well, I know my dad is an attorney, and so I know that like you can use psychologists in like when you do jury selection for pretrial stuff. There's a lot of evals with the client. Is like, were they competent? Are they competent to stand trial? Do they understand what they're being accused of, the procedures and everything? And then also, like, were they competent at the time that they committed the offense?
Yeah, that's great, Hayden. You're bringing in a whole bunch of different things there. Yeah, so psychologists help judges decide whether someone is competent to stand trial, whether something like a not guilty by reason of insanity defense should be offered. But yeah, I think one of the lesser known ones is that they do consult on jury selection. So they help people, lawyers in particular, figure out sort of how to build the best jury for their client. And we'll talk about later in the semester how that process goes and how the psychologist can be involved. But yeah, that's actually a fairly lucrative thing to do for a psychologist, because you get paid pretty good money as a consultant, regardless of what field you're in, to be honest. Anything else people are thinking of? There's one I'm kind of shocked no one mentioned, and that's the only reason I'm pulling, and that's profiling. Like usually that's the first thing people say, because you see that really commonly, I think, on TV shows. And we'll talk later in the semester about maybe the scientific validity of that. But also, like, I always sort of have to break hearts and tell people there just aren't that many profiling jobs available. That doesn't mean you can't do that if you're not determined and ready to go for it. But I think people think that like every police department has a profiler, and unfortunately most just don't have the money for that type of thing. So I love everything you all talked about, because it's spot on and sort of the range of things that psychologists can do. Alrighty, so forensic psychology, as I mentioned, is a term that's used kind of interchangeably with the idea of psychology and the law. And so the term forensic translates directly to forum, and it's from the Latin, and it refers to where the Romans held their trials. They held their trials in the forum. So the current meaning is really the relationship between one professional field with the legal system. So there's not only forensic psychology, but there's forensic medicine, forensic anthropology. So like the show Bones is based around that. Forensic chemistry, for example. So there are lots of ways that these can intersect. And in fact, I think sometimes Dr. Howard teaches an elective in forensic chemistry. So basically, it is how psychology intersects and interacts with the legal system. And as we'll see throughout the course, there's a whole host of ways that this can happen. And so based on that definition, I thought I would pull out some of the more specific definitions put forth by professional bodies for forensic psychologists. So the specialty guideline for forensic psychologists is a set of ethical guidelines for people who practice forensic psychology. And their definition is, and you don't have to write down or memorize these definitions, I just sort of want to give you a feel for how it's discussed in the literature. So a field that covers all forms of professional conduct when acting with definable foreknowledge, gotta love the, like SAT words and all these things, as a psychological expert on explicitly psychological issues in direct assistance to the courts, parties to legal proceedings, correctional and forensic mental health facilities, administrative, judicial, and legislative agencies acting in a judicial capacity. So the really interesting thing there, and this is something those of you who were in ethics and professional issues with me last semester that we talked about, is that that definition includes correctional psychology. Some definitions will say that forensic psychology is separate from correctional psychology or psychologists who work in prison settings. So just sort of know that that's a mini controversy in the field. But again, most of the professional things you're going to see are going to put it all under the same umbrella. The American Board of Professional Psychology is a board that provides certification. So if you've ever heard a medical doctor talk about being board certified in their specialization, you can do that in psychology too. It costs additional money, it takes additional time, but you get advantages. It's recognized across all the states. So typically when you move from state to state as a psychologist, you have to re-license and usually take a new exam specific to those states' laws. They call it the ABEP, even though there are no vowels, they call it the ABEP. With an ABEP, there are a bunch of states now that let you just switch your license without doing any of that additionally, because they recognize you've gone above and beyond. And I've actually been involved in an exam for board certification in the past. Not myself going through it, but one of my grad school professors who is now deceased, rest in peace, Dr. Dowd, but he was on the board for certifying people to do cognitive behavioral therapy, and part of that is supervision. And so he wrote to a bunch of us students and alums and asked us, would any of you be willing to sit in and play the supervisee, just come talk about a complex case? So I did that. And it was great. It was really interesting to see how the process worked. I honestly wish the guy who was being tested had been my supervisor at the time I saw this client, because he had really helpful advice. So it's a really cool process. And again, you get sort of extra recognition for going through this, and you can do it in a whole bunch of sub areas of psychology, and forensic psychology is one of them. So they define it as the application of the science and profession of law to questions and issues relating to psychology and the legal system. So they keep it very broad, and not that specific at all, which is on purpose, right? So again, I love that they emphasize the science of it. What we'll see throughout the semester is a lot of what happens in forensic psychology is based on basic scientific research that psychologists in this area do. So that's really important. And then the American Board of Forensic Psychology, which is the subgroup of the APEP board that does this specific exam, has collaborated with the division of the American Psychological Association that is for people who are forensic psychologists, so it's the American Psychology Law Society, to come up with this definition: the professional practice by psychologists within the areas of clinical psychology, counseling psychology, neuropsychology, and school psychology, when they are engaged regularly as experts and represent themselves as such in activity primarily intended to provide professional psychological expertise to the judicial system. So here we're talking about the applied fields. So clinical is what I have my PhD in. Typically, it gives you a lot of leeway into what you can specialize in afterwards. So I know someone from my school who got the same degree as me, who's a forensic psychologist. I know someone from my school who got the same degree as me, who's a neuropsychologist. So you go and you specialize after you get sort of an overarching clinical degree. Counseling psychologists, not always, but typically work in private practice or in educational settings. Neuropsychologists are going to be looking at brain-based disorders and results of injuries, things along those lines. And then school psychologists are just what they sound like. They work in K through 12 schools, typically. The only other thing I want to explain is sort of what the heck a division of APA is. So the American Psychological Association is huge. I think it has like 15,000 plus members. And so to make people feel like they have a niche within there are, I believe now, more than 50, might be more than 60 divisions of APA that each specialize in something really specific. So obviously the American Law Society, Psychology Law Society. I'm a member of the Society for the Psychology of Women, which is Division 35, but I'm also a member of the Division on the Teaching of Psychology, which is Division 2. So you can join more than one of those depending on sort of what you do and what your interests are. And then I have to give a little shout out here to Dr. Jack Graham. He is now retired, but he was my professor who taught me my forensic psych class when I was in grad school. He had often served as an expert witness because he is one of the people who helped write the MMPI, which we'll talk about a lot this semester in terms of assessments. He also was just like the nicest, most down-to-earth guy. Like, he's this huge name in the field. And, you know, the class we had, I think there were only like 5 or 6 of us that took it. And we just like sat around a conference table and chatted with him about things. It was great. And so his is pretty broad, like the ABEP definition. So activities of mental health professionals as they deal with issues having to do with the law. And he said, you're doing forensic psychology anytime you offer services intended to address legal issues. So again, that could be assessing someone, it could be doing sort of correctional therapy type things, it could be being a consultant. Also, anytime you offer opinions or services intended to assist the legal system in resolving issues, then you are also doing forensic psychology. All right, so we're going to do just a brief history here of forensic psychology. There's way more than this that we'll kind of get into more throughout the semester, but at least getting you some baseline of how did psychology even get involved in the legal system. So back in 1908, Hugo Munsterberg wrote a book called On the Witness Stand. He argued that psychologists should have involvement in a number of aspects of the legal system. Many felt his claims were exaggerated. His book was 269 pages and had no references. Like, he would get an F from one of us, right? That's plagiarism technically, right? So his proposal was largely ignored at the time, but like the seeds of it got into the minds of some people and came forward. So as psychology grew and became more of an applied science, psychology really started as just a lab science, but especially with the World War, psychologists got more and more involved in doing therapy and assessment. Psychologists were called on more and more in court. However, when we first started testifying, oftentimes we were questioned if we didn't have an MD, and they would argue like, well, you're a PhD, what do you really know? So again, just to sort of clarify some fun stuff here, an MD is the degree you get when you're going to be a physician, a doctor. And no doctor is going to want me telling you this, but as Dr. Dowd used to tell us, technically, an MD is a master's degree, right? We don't think of it in the same way, but you're not doing a doctorate because you don't do a database dissertation. So you are training in a practical setting. Simba came and did a little Simba bomb here. So that you are learning to apply things, right? PhDs typically do 4 to 6 years in a very specific field and are learning to do research, do a database dissertation, are creating new knowledge, and again, might also be trained in application here too. I had to move my keyboard because he was about to type stuff to y'all. So we don't have a problem with being called experts, and you know, obviously, and within academia, certainly we wouldn't, but the larger society tends to view medical doctors as sort of more revered. This is why over last semester, you may have seen, I think it was over Christmas break, the article where in the Atlantic, a guy basically told Jill Biden not to go by doctor. He was like, I called her like Hun or Sugar Pie or Sweetie or something ridiculous. So I actually bought a shirt that says, that's Dr. Biden to you, sir. She has earned her doctorate. Physicians actually like took the name doctor initially from PhD people to get respect. And again, I fully respect physicians. I think that we should be on par with each other, but society tends not to see that. And we see that even today, obviously. In Brown versus the Board of Education, so this is the famous school segregation case in 1954, social science research was cited to support the negative effects of segregation on self-image of children. So the APA actually wrote an amicus brief citing the work of Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark. Often Kenneth gets all the credit, but his wife was also a psychologist who was there. And they are the ones who did the famous doll study, which you may have heard of before. So they showed African-American children black and white dolls and asked them like, which one's the prettiest, which one's smarter, and the kids always pointed to the white doll. And so they showed that like this is having an impact on the kiddos. And that was really the first time where something that wasn't a like accepted natural science was used in that way and respected. In 1962, there was a case that was Jenkins versus the US. And this was the first time that psychologists were recognized as expert witnesses. So for the Brown case, like I said, they just wrote a brief. They didn't go testify. In Jenkins versus the US, they said, yes, a psychologist is an expert. They should be able to testify. In 2001, forensic psychology became recognized by the APA as a specialty field. That is when their division of APA started up. And there are training opportunities that continue to grow for people interested specifically in forensic psychology. So there are specific master's programs now in forensic psychology. There are also pre-doctoral internships and postdoctoral fellowships that specialize in this as well. And in fact, the correctional ones in particular are some of the highest paying internships because it's hazard pay, right? Anytime you're in a prison setting, you can, in theory, be putting yourself in harm's way. So what do forensic psychologists actually do? Well, we've hinted at a lot of it already, right? So if they work exclusively as a forensic psychologist full-time, there's a couple different ways that they work. So they can practice forensic psychology. Some of them are employed by the judicial system. So their employer is actually the court. So they might be hired by family court, and they work in a building that's part of the court's building or facilities, and they do evaluations, counseling, etc. They might also be hired by, a criminal as a second opinion, or they may work for a specific attorney or firm, as Hayden alluded to. You also could work for a government agency. So the FBI and the CIA, for example, do have some forensic psychologists, although they're not, again, as common as we see on TV. Most people that do that, honestly, are like psychology PhDs. A lot of times, people who work for the FBI or the CIA are people that are attorneys or have become police officers and sort of work their way to that opportunity. And then they work in correctional settings. So again, some people make this distinction between forensic and correctional, where forensic would be the process up until entering the correctional facility, so all of the trials and whatnot. And then correctional would be once you're in the jail or the prison or the state hospital, for example. But like I said, a lot of other people don't make that distinction. However, most people who work in forensic psychology are not in full-time practice in forensic psychology. So for example, Jack Graham, his job was to be a professor at Kent State, but then he would be called upon to serve as an expert witness in certain cases. It's often just part of what they do, in part because it's still a newer area of specialization. I mean, if you think about it, it's only like 20 years old based on when the APA recognized it. And it is in part because they're often doing a different job and get involved in forensic things tangentially. And also in part because having a steady paycheck becomes a big issue for a lot of people, understandably, right? So if you're part of a civil suit, then you're usually paid out of settlements or by insurance companies. Lawyers, incidentally, usually get about 1/3 to half of settlements. But there might be some cases where like the client doesn't win, right? And so then how are they going to pay your fees? In criminal work, it really depends on how you get involved. So you can be hired by the court and paid out of public funds. Then you work for the court or the prosecution. On the defense side, you might be paid by a defense attorney who gets the money from the client. Oftentimes, they'll just include it in their fee, and then they will pay you. And if it is someone who's like a public defender, right, they're getting paid by the county, they're probably not getting a ton of money, so they're not going to be able to pay you directly. You'll have to work with the client. So there's lots of ways people get involved, and there's lots of roles they could serve here. So these are the 5 distinct roles that your text lays out. That being said, it is possible for someone to have a job that is in more than one of these, right? Or to have a job in one of these, but then serve in some capacity part-time as another one of these. So for each of the roles that a psychologist can choose, there are ethical standards of behavior that apply. And we'll talk about those as we discuss each role and go through. So basic scientists study phenomena for the sake of and satisfaction of understanding it. And then that basic understanding can be applied to the practice of forensic psychology. Sometimes the basic scientist themselves seeks to apply those findings, but they don't necessarily have to. Their results can, though, address really important legal issues. So, for example, basic studies on adolescent brain development may be relevant to decision-making about whether to commit a crime. A prime example here is the photo down in the corner. This is Elizabeth Loftus, who we'll talk much more about when we talk about eyewitness testimony later in the semester. That is her thing. She does a ton of work on that. She's actually, maybe this won't surprise you. I'm going to say, like, this is controversial a lot. I mean, anything in psychology, but particularly as it interacts with the legal system and can directly impact someone's life, right, has the potential to be controversial. And her controversy is she's done a lot of work about implanted memories or perhaps false memories. And so she's sometimes called to testify as an expert witness, say, against someone who is bringing up allegations of child abuse. And so for that reason, there are definitely people who are victim advocates who are not a big fan of her. In terms of ethics here, it's really about how they do their research. So they can't fabricate data. And there have been cases of this in psychology. There have been cases of this outside of psychology. They can't plagiarize. They can't present a skewed selection of the data to hide observations that don't fit their conclusions. This actually happened in sort of health psychology within the past 5 years. So some of you may have heard of this case of Brian Wansink, who did some of this. Well, what if we looked at and cut the data this way instead? And so a lot of his studies have been retracted. And psychologists get really up in arms because it makes us look bad. And fun factoid, Brian Wansink is the brother of our very own Dr. Craig Wansink. I've never talked to him about it. I don't want to make him speak for his brother's mistakes. But interesting little connection there. I don't think our Dr. Wansink has ever done anything like that. Call it a hunch. They are the same ethics that apply to any psychologists conducting research. In essence, we're supposed to report what we find, regardless of whether it supports what they want it to support. So my thesis research, for example, for my master's degree in grad school, I wanted to look at whether feminist beliefs might serve as a protective factor against developing body dissatisfaction. And what I found is that it buffered, the people who were high on feminism were here, and the people who are not really here. So there was an effect, but I wanted to see the other people down here, right? It was a bummer, but that's still what we reported. It still got published. And there are people who would be tempted to fabricate that data. And even I remember my committee members, I had, I think, 3 women and a man, and the women were all we wanted this to work. And I was I know. And he was into it too. He was why wasn't it? But, it is what it is. That's research. I've had people who don't believe in science be well, you're going to find what you want to find. And I'm wow, I really wish that was true. I'd have so many more publications, right? No, that's not how science works. It's a very long and frustrating process. And the only time it can move quickly is when someone throws a lot of money at it, which is why we have vaccines now for COVID, because they did everything they normally do. They just could do it a lot faster because they had the money to do so. Another example, my least favorite example here, is for years, and to this day still, people cite a 1998 study by Andrew Wakefield to say that the MMR vaccine causes autism. It's used to champion not vaccinating children. Jenny McCarthy, who is on The Masked Singer, is one of the biggest voices for this. His study had many problems, including it was not approved by an ethics committee. He subjected children to invasive procedures. So he took blood samples at his son's birthday party. Let's celebrate, right? And then he literally fabricated and manipulated data. So this is a quote from an article in the Sunday Times of London, which examined his study and really was the one who brought to light how messed up it was. However, our conclusion, confirmed by evidence, reveals that in most of the 12 cases, the children's ailments, as described, were different from their hospital and GP records. GP is general practitioner. Although the research paper claimed that the problems came within days of getting the vaccine, in only one case did medical records suggest that was true. And in many of the cases, medical concerns had been raised before the children were vaccinated. So, fun fact about Andrew Wakefield. I'm full of fun facts today. he was not anti-vax when he did the study. He was trying to develop a different MMR vaccine with a different company and make money off of it. And now he's held up as like this anti-vax person. This is obviously problematic, and it's been cited in court cases suing vaccine manufacturers in the past. Again, when it was false information. So that paper was completely retracted, which is super rare in any kind of publication in an academic journal. Like typically they'll publish a correction, but the Lancet completely retracted it. All right, so you can be a applied scientist, and one of the ways you can do that is to serve as a witness. Now, there are two different ways you can be a witness. Just like anyone else, a psychologist can testify as a fact witness, where they testify on things they experience. So maybe they actually witnessed a crime, not in their role as psychologists, but, walking down their street. Applied scientists may apply their findings of their profession by serving as expert witnesses. An expert witness is someone who possesses special knowledge about a subject, knowledge that the average person does not have, or in this case, the average juror in particular. So they're dedicated to applying knowledge to solve real life problems. And so in terms of ethics here, they can't talk about things that they didn't personally experience in terms of doing an assessment on the person or, their knowledge. They can't speculate what was happening at the time of the crime if they weren't there, right? They can state opinions and conclusions in addition to facts. They can be asked to evaluate the person and then testify about that, or testify on an area of expertise. So I talked about Elizabeth Loftus testifying about eyewitness testimony, Jack Graham being called in to testify about the MMPI. Now, in terms of who gets to do these expert testimony roles, you need to be qualified. So you need to have training and or experience, and those credentials need to be without question. Anytime you're on a witness stand, for whatever reason, the opposite side is going to try to pick holes into everything for their side of the case. So you want to be above reproof in terms of your credentialing. And the big thing is when something is beyond the understanding of the average person on a jury. That's the big qualifier that's been used here. So the judge has to be convinced that the testimony the expert will present requires special knowledge, skill, or experience, and that will help the jury make better decisions, better legal decisions. So in addition to like eyewitness testimony, the psychologist might testify on topics like employee discrimination or false confessions, things along those lines. So even though some expert witnesses, most of the time expert witnesses are hired by one side or the other, they are responsible for reporting all their conclusions and all the science. So they can't, just like when they're publishing, they can't like skew their data. Let me see, whose name, sorry. Someone asked what was his name again. And probably like way back here. If anyone else knows, feel free to answer in the chat. If not, sure, I'll stick around after class and I can find it for you in my notes. So they can't just show half truth. So let's say you're hired to assess whether someone is not guilty by reason of insanity. And you find they do have some mental illness, but you also find through your records review that they were like well medicated and doing well in therapy at the time of the crime. So like, even though they had a mental illness, it probably wasn't the reason they committed the crime. You need to say that, even if the person who hired you is like, I really want you to prove their, NGRI. So they are responsible for reporting all their conclusions, and it can be really difficult to achieve objectivity, especially given the good money you get paid to do this. So what Jack shared with us is he would get paid upwards of $400 an hour to do this. And that was back in 2007, so I'm sure it's much higher now. So some of the court cases here. Fry versus the US, way back in 1923, said that to be admissible, expert testimony must be based on generally accepted scientific theory. Generally accepted scientific theory. As you could guess, though, like, that becomes problematic, right? So, like, what's scientific? Who gets to decide, right? Some negative implications is that you can't talk about new methodology or new findings, right? Unless a significant proportion of professionals agree. And interestingly, some states still use this standard to decide whether or not an expert witness can testify. So in these states, they will have Fry hearings. It's a separate hearing to determine whether the evidence that will be presented by that expert witness is acceptable under the standard. So in Jenkins versus the US in 1962, both the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association, which is the association for MDs who practice psychiatry, wrote opinions. And so they both had skin in the game here. And so the DC Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of psychologists. They said, yes, psychologists can be expert witnesses. And the psychiatrists were trying to say no so that they got all the money, basically. Which, like, kind of can't blame them. Okay. And the judge in this case was Judge Bazelon, and I'll put that in the chat for you. Because his name will come up a lot. He was a very psychology-friendly judge that made some very key decisions that helped psychologists over time. So he cited psychologists' extensive training and qualifications and said, yes, of course they should be able to testify. Federal Rule of Evidence 702, which was in 1976, is for federal courts. And this sort of went against Fry and said, look, if there's a new technique, it doesn't have to be acceptable. Like, the acceptability of it within the field is not necessary for evidence to be admissible in expert testimony. This only applies to federal courts, however. And the US Supreme Court has indicated that judges' decisions about the admissibility of expert testimony based on scientific knowledge must be based on the validity of the science in question. So the case that's cited here is really kind of interesting. It is Daubert versus Merrill Dowell Pharmaceuticals, Inc. from 1993. And this was a case actually concerning birth defects. And so Dow Pharmaceutical was sued because a medication that they developed allegedly caused birth defects when pregnant women took it, and they didn't warn anyone about that. And the Daubert decision listed 4 factors that judges should consider in assessing the validity of an expert testimony. So whether or not to allow the expert to testify in front of the jury. Because one of the things that psychology shows us is once the jury hears something, even if the judge says strike that, the jury has heard it, right? And so you need to decide whether or not you're going to put something in front of the jury. And so the first is whether the expert's theory or technique, can be and has been tested scientifically. So is it falsifiable? Can we put it to the test in an experiment and find support for or against it? So that's number 1. Number 2 is, has it been evaluated by peer review? The peer review process is something that all academics go through, all scientists go through. So you write up an article, you submit it to a journal, and usually blinded, 3 to 4 experts in your field read it and offer their feedback. And that's considered the gold standard that all science needs to go through. Now, is it perfect? No. But it, again, is sort of what we judge everything based on. The third one is the reliability and error rate of the claims. So is this something you're finding consistently in multiple studies? And 4, the extent to which the expert's techniques and claims have been generally accepted. So it's not complete acceptance, but generally accepted by the scientific community. So can it be tested? Has it undergone peer review? How reliable is it? And is it generally accepted? So then there was a case that, again, seems kind of weird to include a psychologist in, right? But it was Kumho Tire, C, versus Carmichael. You see here is company. And in this case, the Supreme Court decided the Daubert criteria apply to any testimony based on technical or even non-scientific knowledge. So this was a tire failure case, and the tire expert who testified used a methodology he had developed himself. And so what this case said, like, okay, the opinion of that expert witness can be based on experience, but technical experiential evidence has to meet the same criteria. So he should have like had other people test those same techniques. Yes, Casita, I can repeat the 4 things. So the first one is it falsifiable? Can it be tested? The second is, has it been evaluated by peer review? The third is, how reliable is it? And then the fourth is it generally accepted? So you will hear Daubert referenced as the criteria for expert witness, or read about it as you go through things. So psychology kind of is influenced by both of these cases. There we go. Another thing you can be, which a lot of people don't think about, is you can be a policy evaluator. So they use their methodological skills to evaluate how well an intervention worked. So, for example, does chemical castration of released rapists actually reduce their rate of sexual violence? So if you're not familiar with chemical castration, you give the sex offender medication that essentially makes it so they can't get an erection. So that might be the type of question that you would do. Other things, is this, for example, the VA rolled out using specific empirically supported therapies for depression and PTSD about 10 years ago. Did that actually work? Should we reevaluate? In terms of ethics, the policy evaluator has similar responsibilities to the expert witness. So they must report all the results they obtain, even if whoever hired them doesn't want them to say the law isn't working, right? And they have to report those regardless of whether the results are desirable or of pressures to interpret them in a certain way. And the standard rules of scientific procedure in general apply. So it's essentially kind of like a basic scientist, but their role is really specific. It is testing whether these policies are effective. All right, the forensic evaluator. I would say that this is probably the most common role for forensic psychologists to be in full-time employment. So they may be asked to evaluate individuals involved in either civil or criminal cases, to report their findings to a judge, and at times to testify. So this is, again, I think a misconception we get from TV. We kind of think that psychologists are always in court, like on the witness stand, defending things. So while I was a sophomore in college, job shadowed a forensic psychologist for a day, and she said she went and testified maybe once every 6 months. Most of the time, you send a written report to the judge for every case regardless, and most of the time the judge just took that at face value. So it's a lot of report writing, basically. Sample topics could be evaluating whether someone is competent to stand trial, evaluating their risk of future criminal behavior, evaluating whether they were incapacitated or didn't know the difference between right and wrong at the time of a crime. That would be for not guilty by reason of insanity cases. Or what we've already referenced, doing something like a child custody evaluation. The other thing that's not on my list in my notes, but is commonly done, would be to assess people for emotional damages after some sort of accident. So like maybe an auto accident or workers' comp type of thing. You might be asked to assess that as well. So there's two ways to become involved. So as I mentioned, the court-appointed are fairly common, or you could be hired by one of the parties involved. So the defense, the prosecution, the plaintiff. So generally, as I just mentioned, the first line of communication for this, folks, will be a written report. And sometimes if you're hired by, say, an attorney, and you give them your report and you don't give them the opinion they want, they'll just be like, thanks for your time, here's your money, you're done now. The other side can then depose you, and you are under oath and you have to answer questions by the opposing attorney. So I have been, not as a professional, as an expert witness, but as a fact witness, I have been part of a deposition, and it was like one of the most intimidating things I've ever been through. It's also kind of weird because like the attorneys ask you questions and make objections like they do in court, but there's no trier of fact, there's no judge there. So like the other lawyer would object, but then say, you can answer. It's like, there's no one there to say whether or not you have to answer, so you just do. So that was sort of an interesting experience. You can give sworn testimony under oath. And again, often you don't do that, but this would happen with the attorney. And then at the trial, you may be asked to offer your opinions, provide evidence, be cross-examined by the other side. And again, they might only do this once or twice a year if you're working for a court system. Again, typically, the judge will take your report at face value, especially if it's well-written. But in high-profile cases, this could happen. So one of my other undergraduate professors, Yossi Ben-Porath, another expert in the MMPI, told us a story about him being called to testify in a case where someone had read the MMPI to this guy. Now, this is problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. Like, it's not designed to be given that way. You know, you can read things in different ways, right, to give people hints at things. And so I could, like, read this line. My one forensic psychologist I talked to said she only did so once or twice a year. I could be like, one forensic psychologist I talked to did so once or twice a year, right? And there are actually, at that time, tapes, but now just audio recordings that can be used. And so he told us this really funny story that like the lawyer really wanted to prove that he was an expert. And so he just kept pulling out like books Yossi had written and articles Yossi had written. Dr. Ben-Porath, did you write this? Dr. Ben-Porath, did you write this? And so the court sketch artist, after the trial was all done, actually gave Yossi a picture he still had in his office of him just like surrounded by this pile of his work. So, you know, sometimes that experience might be sort of interesting for you as that role of being the witness. In terms of ethics here, obviously a lot of things come into play. You have to comply with the ethical code as described by the ethical principles of psychologists and the code of conduct. Also those specialty guidelines that I mentioned already for forensic psychologists. And there are even different guidelines for doing child custody evaluations. So you have to make sure you know all of that. So being a forensic psychologist, you not only have to know your psychology, you have to know the laws of the municipality and you're working in, because those can differ from place to place. And you also have to know all these different ethical guidelines. So basically, all of these things say the same thing in some ways. Your evaluations have to be clear in their purpose, like I'm doing this as a child custody evaluation. They're conducted by competent individuals, so you have to be competent. You can't, let's say I hired one of you as like an intern for me. I couldn't just send you with no training to do the assessment, right? That'd be a really bad idea. You have to be respectful of appropriate relationships. So, you can't hook up with the person you're assessing. You have to provide the appropriate level of confidentiality. So this is sort of weird because if that person who came to you was your client, you wouldn't tell anyone else what they said, right? But they're not your client, it's who hired you. So it might be the court system, it might be their attorney. And so you have to let that person you're evaluating know, like, hey, I am going to tell this information to this person, regardless of what you tell me. So if you tell me you did the crime, I have to say that, right? So, that's important, and important that the person understands that. You have to use methods and procedures that are accurate, current, and consistent with science and the standard of practice. So, for example, we are on right now the 4th edition of the intelligence scale that is generally accepted. I couldn't use the 3rd edition for a court case just because that's what I have laying around on my shelf. Right, that would be immediately thrown out. And you also have to communicate them appropriately. The way Jack described this to us is you have to assume that every word, every sentence that you're going to write in your report will be scrutinized. So whenever people tell me like, oh, I'm going to go into psychology, so it doesn't matter if I can write, I'm like, yeah, right. This is probably like the most careful writing you'd ever have to do in your life. So in most municipalities, most court systems, the expert witness cannot give an opinion about what's called the ultimate issue. So the ultimate issue is what's being decided in the trial. So if I were to evaluate someone, I couldn't say this person is guilty because that's not my job as a psychologist to decide. It's the judges or the juries, right? They cannot explicitly say whether or not, even if they think someone is competent to stand trial. You have to sort of hint at it. Instead, you just present your evidence and talk about what you know or believe. But again, you can't say this person is incompetent to stand trial. Now, that does vary a little bit from municipality to municipality, but generally, that's what's true. All right, and then as Hayden mentioned before, they can be consultants. And so trial consultants help with jury selection by using scientific jury selection procedures. Again, trying to get the best jury possible for that person's client. They'll conduct community attitude surveys to see how the community is feeling. They'll prepare witnesses to testify. So they might sit down with them and coach them on not becoming too angry or things along those lines. They can advise lawyers on their presentation strategies. And they can also conduct mock trials so that a lawyer might get a feel for how an argument will land with a jury. Ethics here, there's no expectation of impartiality in this role. You are beholden to the person that hires you, which is typically one of the attorneys. And psychologists, as trial consultants, subscribe to the ethical code of attorneys, interestingly, not the APA ethics code. So that's the ethics code of the American Bar Association. So they are there to assist the attorney in winning the case. They're not practicing as an applied psychologist in the way we would typically think of it. So because this sort of starts to get at a lot of questions about, what is, like what's the difference between being a forensic and a clinical person? How do these things affect people? I have a diagram, and like once upon a time, I had this in Word, but my hard drive was erased the second year I was here, and like a very naive noob, I did not have everything backed up, so I only have my hard copy of this. So you get a lovely cell phone picture of this. It is available on Blackboard as well. But this is a cell phone picture of my notes. So hopefully you can read them. And oop, don't want it zoomed in quite that much. Okay, we got two options, super zoomed or not zoomed at all. So we'll go with not zoomed at all, because you can actually read it. So forensic and clinical people, again, even though they might have the exact same degree from the exact same place, they might deal with things in totally different ways. So who is your client? You know, if you're a clinician, that's the person in front of you. It's the person you're evaluating, it's the person you're treating. As we just talked about, for forensic folks, it's the person who hired you. So it might be the court system. If you're doing any kind of evaluation for like a public safety person, it is the department who hired you, you know, the attorney who hired you. So there's not the same confidentiality with the person in front of you. There's not the same relationship. And in some ways, a lot of times you might kind of be seen as the enemy or the gatekeeper for that person in front of you getting what they want, right? Now, in terms of diagnosis, what role does it play? For clinical people, it's important. You have to have a diagnosis to get reimbursed by insurance. And you have to, it also is helpful to educate them about their diagnosis. If you are a forensic psychologist, it's almost irrelevant because the questions you're being asked to answer are not what disorder does this person have? It is, do they meet the legal criteria in terms of, do they know the difference between right and wrong, right? Do they understand what's going to go on in the court proceedings for not guilty or for a competent to stand trial? So very, very different. Also thinking about continuous versus dichotomous. So in forensic psychology, you're pressed to make yes, no, black and white statements. In clinical settings, you acknowledge that things aren't typically just yes, no, right? There are degrees, there's a continuum of things. In terms of motivation to distort, right? In the forensic setting, you actually have to always assume people may be distorted. What are some of the reasons why you think people would be lying to you or trying to look better or worse than they are in the legal setting? And again, you can chat or you can unmute.
So the jury takes their side?
Yeah, definitely. All right, I'm going to mute real quick while I blow my nose. Yeah, so the jury can take their side, and it's interesting because depending on the question, it will be different, right? So if you're trying to say you're not guilty by reason of insanity, you're going to try to look super crazy, right? But if you're trying to get custody of your child, you're going to try to look like the best person ever, right? And so there's different distortions depending on the question that's being asked. Whereas in clinical settings, most of the time, they're not motivated. They want help, but some will for various reasons, whether it be shame or whether it be a part of their pathology. In terms of temporal focus, when you're doing therapy with someone, you're focusing on the now. How do they interact? What is the diagnosis? How can you help them? In forensic psychology, you're kind of a detective. You're often having to reconstruct something that happened in the past. So at the time of the crime, did they understand if it was right or wrong? That's a really hard question to answer, right? And so the question about current status only really relates to things like competence to stand trial or custody evaluations, things along those lines. And then standard of proof. In clinical settings, we look at statistical significance based on research findings and also clinical significance. Is it actually going to make a difference in that person's life and help them? So depending on, again, your municipality and the type of case, it might be really different in forensic settings. So beyond a reasonable doubt is the evidence has to be extraordinarily strong, essentially 90%. Clear and convincing is sort of almost that high, but not quite. A preponderance of the evidence is, as I've heard it described, 50% plus a feather. So like just a little bit over 50-50. And so you want a reasonable degree of psychological certainty. You want to describe the basis of your opinion on all the information you have, and then explain why you can rule out other explanations, essentially. Alrighty, so I am going to stop there for today. I can stop screen sharing here. And again, that diagram is on Blackboard with the PowerPoint, so you can not have to squint at it. And then on Tuesday, we will do our activity. First thing, we'll talk about the Tarasov case, which is a big case in the history of psychology and the legal system. So I will do my normal thing and stick around a couple minutes in case anyone has questions. If not, have a good weekend. Enjoy yourself in the snow before it melts.
I had a quick question. What was the name of it was a, hold on, of the guy with the vaccine for all?
Wakefield. Andrew Wakefield.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay.
I just wanted to apologize for being late. I got to work and my boss comes out and she's like, Erin, what are you doing here? And it occurred to me that I had packed like my stuff for work. So I was just thinking go to work, but like I had a whole class in between.
It's all good. The PowerPoint's all on Blackboard, and honestly, this chapter in particular is mostly from the chapter, so you should be able to piece through anything that you missed.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.